Welcome. This is our landscape of early neuropsychological changes in Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementia project webinar series kickoff, or setting the stage webinar. I am Luke Stokel at the National Institute on Aging and the NIH, and part of the leadership team for this webinar series. And also want to acknowledge Becky Rickless, who is communications and logistics lead and has the good fortune of corralling us all together. Becky, you can give a wave.
Hi, everyone.
This is the rest of our leadership team. You'll be hearing from Bob and Laura later, and we'll also be integrating some of Maya's thoughts into what we present. This group forms our leadership committee, providing scientific oversight of this effort. And each of these folks will also be joining the webinars and will serve as moderators for the general discussion session that will close our webinar series. You can read our leadership team bios at the QR codes below the profile pics. First, some history. So neuropsychological measures for Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementia, or ADRD trials broadly have focused on advanced cognitive decline as the clinical endpoint. As seen here in Yaquiel Quiros's adaptation of Risa Sperling, Sperling et al.'s famous figure here on the right of their 2011 paper on so-called preclinical or pre-symptomatic AD and ADRD. And a key recommendation from that paper is to focus earlier in the disease course, so here as opposed to here, for effective treatment and prevention. There were other limitations for early neuropsychological protocols developed for AD and ADRD trials, including these listed on the left. We'll address each of these in our talk today, as well as in the webinars that will follow. We'll hear also more on this from Bob next, and we also have an overview of AD-ADRD landscape paper by speaker Rhoda Au, shared with this group for additional background. And this is from Maya. Ultimately, we are trying to model change at the individual level, so strategies for deep, ecologically valid phenotyping that focus on moving towards single subject within person change and personalized precision methods that capture the landscape of cognitive and non-cognitive functions will be desirable. You can see our measurement and methods needs in the column on the left. These include, developing things specifically for preclinical AD and ADRD, taking advantage of digital and mobile technologies and measures, making sure everything is psychometrically sound. That is something that has not changed forever in neuropsychology. Open access, we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Community-driven, efficient and low cost, as well as culturally fair, another important concept we'll speak more about later. Also from Maya, this encourages tool integration at different disease stages. And the figure on your right, you can see this includes predicting disease, detecting disease, staging disease here, as well as disease tracking and monitoring treatment response. This also includes multi-domain markers, including biomarkers and imaging across affect, function, behavior, and cognition. And as tools move from the clinic to the real world, a better understanding of in-home assessment effects, engagement, validation of meaningful change, and privacy become important. Ultimately, we are trying to model change at the individual level, as said earlier. So strategies for deep ecologically valid phenotyping that moves to that individual level is where we're aiming. So across these efforts, it will be important to emphasize our broader goal to support and build towards brain health equity, including methods and measurement considerations. These include guidance from folks like Javier Cagagas and Elizabeth Rose Maeda at UCLA with the same organization as Bob, including sampling strategies and selection, the use of threshold language, development of a cultural relevance index for our measures, and a focus on community participatory research for measures development and testing, as well as use. Here is a slide from Evelyn Gallego from the Gravity Project at a recent NIH workshop on integrating social determinants and structural influence measures into biomedical research. This covers some general definitions of health equity. And this can be extended to the brain and neuropsychological health equity, especially as it relates to AD and ADRD measurement and prevention. As you can see, there are both community level and individual level areas of emphasis. And finally, on the bottom right is a QR code here for the NIH FINEX Social Determinants of Health Assessments collection. We recommend you take a look there. Now to our immediate goals. The landscape of early neuropsychological changes ADRD project addresses gaps in the type of constructs and measures, again, beyond cognition alone, that characterize early neuropsychological changes in AD and ADRD, and how to advance research to develop promising measures into usable data points to inform the design, execution, and assessment of the success of prevention trials. On the lower right is more about our interests from our Division of Behavioral and Social Research, where myself and Becky sit if you want more information and background. Key questions we want our speakers, moderators, and attendees to consider are here. These include key gaps, barriers, opportunities, and research priorities for measurement development for early detection, as well as considerations that will inform design and conduct of trials. What are both measurement and infrastructure needs? How can we contribute to research efforts that promote brain health equity, prioritizing DEIA and open science principles and practices? And what are promising approaches that haven't worked or have underperformed, and why? You'll be seeing a lot of this figure today. Our leadership team identified 4 principles to guide our thinking about measurement and infrastructure needs that will advance our research goals. We want open, inclusive, and accessible, including usable tools and infrastructure to lower barriers for collaboration and meet end user needs, and integrated to capture the multi-level, multimodality, and multi-type measures and data we'll be discussing over the course of these webinars. We recognize this is a big ask, and that's why we pulled together this group. We think these principles are imperative to meet these ambitious goals and make them attainable. Next, you will be hearing from Bob.
All right, thank you so much, Luke, and thanks for including me in this fantastic series. I'm really excited to be participating in it and can't wait for all of the presentations to begin and the webinar series to be launched. I'm happy to present a little bit focused on what are really some of the fundamental measurement issues that we're addressing now. And I think it's good to start closer to the beginning with what we're dealing with and what we need to overcome. We're really confronted with a legacy of measurement methods that are tracked back in the late 19th century in some ways, and never advanced much beyond the 20th century. Indeed, we long have known that clinical judgment is not adequate to assess cognitive impairment. And the legacy of FDA measures really has been pretty inert in its application of the ADOS-COG, along with some other measures that look at clinically meaningful or observable change. And just to give you an idea of how old this is, I was still in graduate school and playing softball with Rich Mose, and Wilmer Rosen was on my dissertation committee the inventor of the ADAS-Cog. So despite our complaints about these instruments, they've been used for decades. This was revised a bit in 2013 when the FDA released some new guidance, and in 2018, the new pathways model. And this has led to a number of attempts to innovate. There are a number of novel approaches that include some empirical validation and development, the CatchCog, revisions of the ADAS, the ADCOMS measure. But so far, these really rely on the same kinds of methods that had previously been used, even though they've been better validated statistically and psychometrically. Meanwhile, outside the world of clinical trials, our screening methods continue to rely on measures, again, that come from even earlier in some cases, the mini mental state exam, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, more recently the SLUMS, but each of these also relies on relatively conventional assessment methods, which really derive from the last century. Moreover, almost all of these methods have reduced all of healthy cognition to about 6 or 7 points. If you just think about the cutoff scores on the mini mental state exam or the MOCA, we basically have those tuned to detect more severe cognitive impairment. And that means our efforts to move towards earlier stages of cognitive impairment are reduced to relatively insensitive methods. Further, the kinds of cut point approaches that are used are really vulnerable to demographic effects and also are subject to training challenges, that these measures are not even, simple though they are not really administered in the same standardized way across sites. So there's a big question, can we do better? And I think that the webinars to come give you a good vision of what things can look like for the future, where novel strategies from genetic prediction through the monitoring of real world outcomes and societal impacts will become possible. Coming back to this, this diagram that I think really is helpful to us in our work, I just wanted to flesh out a few perspectives, and you'll hear much more later. But in terms of the integration of measures, it's really important that the measures be linked across levels of analysis. As we begin to bring in biomarkers, how do we integrate those with cognitive markers and other measures that look at ecologically valid practice? We need to bridge from biology to the environment in a meaningful way based on evidence. Accessibility is critical. Not only do we need to have measures enabled for all individuals overcoming digital divides and other problems with access, we also need to customize assessments for people with different levels of ability. On the inclusive front, it's critical that the measures that we use consider carefully individual differences in language, culture, other individual identities. We have to make sure that we are measuring the same thing in all the people that we're measuring it in. And so far, that has not been the case. And the openness is really important for us to make broad progress. We really would like to see all measures developed to be freely available with source documentation that will really promote collaboration and advancement of the research agenda. Now, what about these measurement needs? I think it's clear that one size is not going to fit all applications. This is a wonderful overview coming from Hempel et al. One of our presenters, Rhoda Au, is a key contributor here, and it highlights the different stages at which different kinds of methodologies are critically important, all the way from understanding predictive features to early symptom detection, to offer opportunities for early intervention. Then as we move forward into the stages of clinical assessment and differential diagnosis, further investigations with biomarkers using algorithms that will lead us to more intensive investigations and more intensive treatments in the future. So this is highly commended. You're going to be hearing much more about these strategies in the coming webinar series. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in are the psychometric approaches. And one of the things that I feel we really not leveraged adequately are modern psychometric approaches to the way we go about measuring things. And we really have enormous opportunities right now to move away from what have traditionally been unidimensional models to multidimensional models. So every test we use can actually generate multiple indicators of different kinds of brain functions or capacities to interact with the environment. Our response models also have not been adequately leveraged. Every response that a person makes actually generates meaningful information, not just total test scores. Furthermore, adaptive testing has really not been used much. It may seem surprising that despite the advent of computerized testing capabilities, we still continue to give tests mostly in fixed formats, whereas if we ask the questions in an order that is based on all prior information, we can do things much more efficiently, at least doubling, often increasing efficiency fivefold. Another key element that we have missed so far is the opportunity to look at measurement invariance using techniques like differential item functioning. We should be able to understand how every item is being calculated in people who come from different backgrounds, determining whether we really are measuring the same things across different groups, and pruning our assessments and giving people only the items that are appropriate for their level of ability and for their other individual characteristics. Another thing is that we worry about validity, yet we don't take advantage of person fit statistics. We can be determining validity from the fit of every item to our growing model of the person as we accumulate data, yet that is so far rarely done. Further, the way that we go about giving people batteries of tests is usually done in a fixed format rather than using dynamic selection of measures based on their positive predictive power and negative predictive power. So in the future, we should be giving people just the test they need to achieve certain kinds of differential diagnostic conclusions or to provide information relevant to different evidence-based recommendations. Another key ingredient that's missing from the landscape so far is smooth integration with healthcare informatics. Now that artificial intelligence approaches and machine learning approaches are offering us enormous insights into big data, we need to be able to access those data in a way that enables us to integrate our cognitive assessment data with all of the information that's already being aggregated in medical records. And this is an enormous task of harmonization and integration of common data elements. Finally, the modern tech data acquisition method, you'll be hearing a lot more about this. We really have so far not well integrated all of the possibilities from mobile devices, wearables, the Internet of Things, we really need to maximize the use of both active and passive data collection methods as we move forward. Now, this question about what are we measuring and how are we measuring it across different groups of people, it really indicates that we need to take a cold, hard psychometric look at what we're doing. We have to figure out what we're measuring, what are the constructs, what are the factors, how can we do that the most efficiently, and how can we make sure we're measuring the same thing in everybody. And there are nice techniques for looking at measurement invariance. The picture on the right is just to illustrate the use of multi-group structural equation modeling that helps to determine whether the factor structures are really the same in both groups. And we can identify different levels of measurement invariance, and depending on the level of invariance that's obtained, we can retune the tests to improve the measurement invariance or figure out how to harmonize the data given what we know about the differences in the measurement methods. So I think we're on the brink of being able to apply this to lots of data. So the ultimate dream is to integrate data across the entire phenome, the complete set of all phenotypes, and use those for precision medicine purposes. We need to get all the data from healthcare information systems, past medical history, surgical history, lab results, biomarkers, whole genome sequences, all of the structural determinants of health, both the individual and personal, and the structural determinants. We can really move forward with our legacy databases in dealing with longitudinal assessment of change in older adults. We've got some great databases already with ADNI, information from the ADRCs and the NAC. Enigma has shown some great promise. We've got the Human Connectome project. on and on. UK Biobank gives us a nice example. And I think we want to figure out how to effectively integrate this with all the novel data streams that are coming up. New tests. I mean, Laura will tell us about testmybrain.org, I hope. There are other things like the Mayo Test Drive. There are international item banks for certain kinds of tests that are being developed, tests that don't show practice effects, but then the entire domain of passive assessments with mobile device, Internet of Things, wearables, implantables. We'll ultimately, I hope, be able to take advantage of all of these tools, integrate them, and then critically use feedback from our assessments to support behavior change, other precision treatments, and more refined diagnostics of the future. So how do we get there from here? I think you're going to hear a lot of great approaches to that. Here's just a handful. I think the building on existing measurement platforms is a start. There are a lot of really strong data infrastructures that have been launched. I think expanding and integrating those will be a fantastic opportunity for research. Building on efforts that identify large samples for acquisition aggregation. So the All of Us, the Whole Genome Sequencing Consortium, the UK Biobank are good examples of that. And then I think that our expanding our focus on common data elements across disorders so that we really begin to have a more common vocabulary and shared knowledge. That will enable us to do a lot more large scale research. And then I think our opportunities are here and now to expand research that harmonizes and leverages data from the electronic medical records. It's really been since 2014 that these have been available or mandated, I should say. It would be nice if, 10 years later, we could really be seeing them smoothly integrated into our research flows. Ultimately, we need to forge new relationships that will promote the shared standards for digital, mobile, and electronic health initiatives across the board, ultimately enabling a smooth integration of the medical record world and the individual data collection world that already is generating huge amounts of information that are largely untapped, and we hope that they will be tapped for good instead of evil. And so with that, let me stop and let's hear from Laura. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob, for that great overview. And thanks to Luke and the other organizers and all the many participants in the webinar series. I think this is going to be a really exciting set of talks. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. Great. So I'm going to be finishing off this introduction by going a bit deeper into the guiding principles that we are asking you all to keep in mind during this webinar series and really form a foundation of thinking about measurement and tools and what this means for the broader world of research and clinical care. So we have some challenges. These have been articulated by Luke and Bob in this entire space. We have to measure many types of neuropsychological variables, neuropsychological differences between groups, neuropsychological change over time, in preclinical stages, clinical stages, in the earliest stages when someone is at risk for dementia, and in response to treatment. Now, as Bob mentioned, there is not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to any of this, which means that really we're looking at a landscape of measures and a landscape of approaches in order to address all of these many important challenges and constraints. Now, in addition to the scientific challenges that we also have limited resources, right? So we aren't in a world of infinite resource. So there's limited resources for research and especially for clinical care. And of course, as many of us know, those resources are already extremely stretched in the clinical care scenario. And many people who need access to even current diagnostic methods and treatments don't have access to these. So thinking deeply about prioritization of efforts that can translate to clinical care in a way that is scalable and accessible to as many people as possible. And finally, as a field, we are grappling with these very deep issues related to brain health disparities and issues of equity. We know, for example, that older Black and Hispanic people are disproportionately more likely to be affected by Alzheimer's and related dementias with far more misdiagnoses than white people and people with more resources. We also know that 2/3 of people with dementia are in low and middle income countries. So we need really measurement solutions and tools that advance progress in research and downstream in clinical care that don't just favor those that are the privileged few. So instruments and approaches that are designed for people who are in these lower and middle income countries and priority populations that have been defined by NIH and NIA, which I'll get into in a second. So with that in mind, these principles are meant to help us address these problems and ground us in the real world significance of where these tools can be and what they can do if designed correctly. So integrated, accessible, inclusive, and open. I'm going to start by talking about what it means to have open tools. So with a focus on neuropsychological assessment tools. So this is my background in building open source tools. And so I've done a lot of thinking about this. And really, when we think about open neuropsychology and open tools, that's at 3 levels. So we can think about the tests themselves, the measurement tools, the approaches, and those being open, those being accessible to people and free of charge for access. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what the implications of that are. We also can think about the scoring algorithms that apply to tests or to different methods of making inferences. So scoring algorithms should be transparent. They should be something that are subject to our scrutiny and to updating, right? So if we don't understand how something is scored, it's very hard to then understand the underlying biases that might exist in those scores, or the way in which those scores might be missing important characteristics. So as Bob was talking about these sort of next generation psychometric techniques, I say next generation, they're a few generations old now, but things that we really should be applying in the next generation of psychometric techniques, it's essential to have access to item level data. If there is a black box scoring algorithm that an approach has that is necessarily bound to that approach, it's really hard to use those more sophisticated methods of looking at things by item and doing things like differential item functioning when everything is a black box. So open and transparent scoring is really important. And then open data. So thinking about not just the data sets that are generated through research, but open norms, right? So many times in clinical care, normative models are being used to interpret a patient's score or a person's score. Those are used for diagnostic purposes. If those normative models and those norms are not themselves open, there's no way to really understand the biases that might be at play. And there are always biases, and really evaluate that in a way that is allows for scientific progress and progress in measurement. So, this is not trivial, right? And this is a big ask to have everything be open. A lot of the landscape of neuropsychological assessment right now is based on proprietary tools that are under strict licensing with pay-per-use. And that makes sense because there needs to be a revenue model for these things. But what it does is it limits re-implementation in different settings or platforms. It limits transparency. And this can be a serious barrier to progress in measurement sciences, as well as getting to a place of broader accessibility. So when I talk about openness, just to be clear, we might say open to mean many, many things, but openness refers specifically to a license that governs how and under what circumstances a test, a measure, an algorithm, or a data set can be used. I think many people think that something that lacks a license or where the license is not enforced in a restricted way is the same as openness, but that leaves a lot of room for changes in the future. So if something is unlicensed and then it goes under a restricted license after it's being broadly used, that can really change the accessibility and the ability to develop that measure over time. So you think of the example of the MMSE, which began with unlicensed and then went to a license that was then enforced on a pay-per-use sort of schedule. So really important to understand this is about thinking about licensing in a critical way that really extends the life of a tool and allows it to be used more broadly. Open access licenses are really about permitting free access, so not having to pay per use, but it's not the same as a measure being free, right? So there are a lot of other barriers to accessibility and a lot of other costs, which I'll talk about in a second. So openness is important for accessibility, but it is not sufficient for accessibility. So although it's a main guiding principle, we also have to be thinking about accessibility. So what does it mean to have accessible measures and accessible neuropsychology? So first off, accessibility is not a yes or no thing. It's not a box that you tick and say, yes, it's accessible or it's not. There are many different types of accessibility and many different degrees of accessibility. And it's something that takes effort to address. It is not something that can be addressed. Openness in comparison is fairly easy. It's a license. Access is limited by many things, by costs of implementation, by expertise. So if there's a burden of expertise that's needed to use a measure, then that's going to limit how accessible it is. By the infrastructure that's needed, you think about primary care settings where there isn't the infrastructure to do a lot of the more sophisticated and expensive measures that we are developing on the research side. Access is limited by generalizability. So what I mean by this is both the contexts in which a measure can be used, but also the populations where it's appropriate. So Bob talked about the fact that, Bob and Luke both talked about the fact that there are cultural barriers and measures are not validated across populations. That is an accessibility issue because it means that those measures are not fit for a particular context. They're not designed for certain populations. And so thinking about very, very deeply is important. And then of course, usability, right? So if the test is not usable, it's really hard to call it accessible. And these needs are all going to differ from basic science to clinical trials to clinical care. And so in addition to it being about type and degree, it's also about context too. And finally, I think we should be thinking about burden as an accessibility issue. Often burden is something that doesn't really come into serious consideration until we start trying to translate to clinical trials and ultimately clinical care. And burden and measurement precision are in direct conflict, right? So the longer the measure is, the better the measurement you get from it, but the more burdensome it is. So thinking about the balance between those two things as burden is an accessibility issue as well. So something that we need to approach thoughtfully and really thinking about what groups lack access or could be harmed by lack of access. So thinking about now, how do we apply these principles? So, some questions that we might ask. So in the sense of openness, is this method implemented or can it be implemented in a way that is open and will enable transparency and facilitate dissemination of methods, algorithms, and results, right? As Bob mentioned, does this method permit integration across studies, levels, and modalities? Methods that can be integrated across levels and across studies are preferred to measures that really are one and done in a particular study. Accessibility-wise, what individuals and communities have access to this method? And importantly, what communities have access limitations because of cost, expertise, infrastructure, or generalizability, right? And it's, again, this is not a, is it accessible or isn't it? What communities is it accessible to? What communities have barriers to accessibility? What are those barriers? And those are important questions to be able to articulate. And, inclusive is the one I talk about last because I feel like all the other guiding principles are really in service to inclusion, right? Ultimately, we want science and clinical care that includes all groups, especially those that are most affected by health disparities. Shown here is the NIA Health Disparities Research Framework, including the priority populations that are the most affected by health disparities and where research has traditionally lagged behind in terms of thinking about these populations, even though the greatest burden of need is in these groups. So, you can ask yourself, does the development or application of this method exclude or have the potential to exclude people based on race, ethnicity, language, age, gender, et cetera? This is the wrong question because the answer is yes. The answer is always yes, right? Anything that we do is going to start with a particular population, which means that it's going to be excluding potentially in its earliest stages other populations. Everything has barriers, everything has biases, right? So really the right question to ask is, what steps are being taken to ensure that the development of application of this method includes those people and those populations most impacted by dementia and who would most benefit from advances in diagnosis and treatment? So you cannot say, yes, my approach is inclusive, or no, my approach is not inclusive. The answer is how inclusive, to what populations, what are the approaches that are being taken to make sure that a measure, an approach, or a body of research is being inclusive. So, and the implication of this question is the prioritization of efforts to develop and validate measures and approaches in populations that are the most vulnerable as a primary aim, rather than having it be a secondary aim once all the rest of the science is done. I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks again to folks at National Institute of Aging and my co-leads in this webinar series and all the participants. Hope you all enjoy the series of talks to come. I personally am very excited, and hopefully this will help us build a better landscape of neuropsychological assessment.
Great, thanks, Laura. I will share my slide deck next. Okay, so we now have our end goal in front of us, and that is for all of the measurement focus of this webinar series. It's important to keep in mind that we're looking towards effective prevention, mitigation of disease, and targeted, personalized, oh, let me swap this, sorry. And targeted, personalized, holistic treatment and care. And this is an illustration of what a prevention trial may look like when the types of measures we'd hope to include using a mechanism-focused framework. This is from Marty Slawinski, who'll be another one of our webinar speakers or participants. And One example of a mechanism-focused framework is the NIH stage model. This is focused on both trial design and testing, and you can scan for the QR code on the bottom left to get more information. For our measurement focus, we'd like to do a better job translating the science to develop measures that tap into mechanism or targets for intervention, which you can see right here. And these are all the various domains that we might consider when we include measures in our trial design. Again, we also are concerned not only with these intermediate measures, but also with the measurement of our intermediate and long-term or ultimate outcomes like reduced risk or disease mitigation. And new tools may also help us identify early risk phenotypes, understand likely disease types and course before disease onset, and predict treatment response and likely outcomes. To help guide us as we work toward these goals, we have planned 6 one-hour webinars with this collection of wonderful speakers and moderators. The first webinar, Assessment of Neuropsychological Change Across the Lifespan, kicks off on November 29th, 2020 at 2022 at 11:15 Eastern Time in the US. You're encouraged to attend all webinars in person. However, we will also be recording these webinars for on-demand viewing in case you cannot attend a session live. This is invite only, and we are limiting invitations outside the speaker moderator group to NIH staff. And there are a couple exceptions here. If you have an early career scientist or two in your labs or community partner collaborators you'd like to join, please just let us know. Finally, we'd like everyone to attend the final webinar, as it will be a general discussion facilitated by our leadership team. Now, what do we expect from you? The speakers are going to dazzle us with science, moderators will guide our discussion, and all others, please use chat during our interactions. Moderators may call on you to clarify questions or respond to speaker inquiries. Come informed, before, make sure you're reviewing the materials shared, the resources, including papers, background. Again, as you come in, mute yourself, stay curious, not a concern of mine. And then other guiding principles or guidelines are here. And then, after, as Laura said earlier, don't let this be one and done in terms of the webinar series, but follow up with communication and identified action items. And as I said, the webinar will be recorded and distributed to participants, but we ask that you do not share. We may be sharing these to the broader public in the future, but right now, until the conclusion of the 6-part series, we're keeping it as invite only. If you have additional questions or comments, you can direct them to myself, Becky, who you met earlier. And that is pretty much it. So on behalf of Bob and Laura, and Becky, I'd like to thank you all. We very much look forward to the upcoming webinars, and we all hope you have a great day. We'll see you soon. Thank you.